The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to the ILSO Advisor webinar, Insect Pest Management in Soybeans, What to Watch Out For in 2020, brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I'm Todd Steinacher, and I will be your moderator for the webinar this morning. Just a few housekeeping items to start with. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar, and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in Integrated Pest Management. If you are listening to this recording from the webinar, you will need to go to Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and self-report for credit. You can ask questions during the webinar by using the chat features in the dashboard on the right side of your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Nick Seiter. Nick is a research assistant professor of field crop entomology at the University of Illinois. He develops management recommendations for insect pests for soybean and corn and has his PhD in entomology from Clemson University. Nick earned his bachelor's and master's degree in entomology as well from Purdue University. The screen is now yours, Nick. Take it away.
Thank you, Todd. Welcome to this webinar. Today we'll be discussing some insect pests in soybean in Illinois that aren't necessarily new to Illinois, but that we might be new to managing in Illinois. Some insects that have been emerging as a problem over the last several years, as well as at least one that's potentially on the horizon, but that hopefully we will not see in Illinois in the near future. First, I would like to discuss the Dectes stem borer, which is an insect that's been receiving a little more attention in southern Illinois the last couple of years. In particular, 2 years ago, the fall of 2018, we did have some issues with lodging caused by this particular insect. This is a longhorn beetle, which is not a type of insect that we're used to seeing necessarily in soybean, and a fairly unique pest in terms of the sorts of damage that it does, some of which you can see in this first slide. Now, Dectes stem borer is going to actually overwinter as a larva, as a mostly grown larva. The adults will begin emerging, and you can see a picture of the adult here. Really, in a couple of weeks here, they'll start to emerge in late June on into July, and those adults begin laying their eggs, especially in soybean petioles. So they'll actually embed their ovipositor into the soybean petiole and lay an egg. That egg will hatch and begin boring its way up and down the petioles. Now, soybean is not the only host. In fact, it's not the primary host for Dectes stem borer. Sunflower seems to be a major host for the insect, and some areas, some states that have been having this insect more, prominently for more years, areas like Kansas, for instance, they have more sunflower production. Another alternate host is giant ragweed. Of course, we've got a little bit of that in Illinois. And areas where you have these plants, and in Illinois, I'd say giant ragweed is going to be the more relevant of those two. You can have increased populations of this insect locally where they're actually developing on these alternative hosts. But as those larvae, which again, the adults have laid their eggs in the petiole beginning in late June, early July, those larvae will start to bore within the stem of that petiole, and that usually causes the petiole to wilt. It will start to turn brown or yellow, and ultimately they often break off at the main stem. You can see a picture of one of these wilting petioles here, and again, a close-up. That tends to be the first sign in a field that you have a Dectes stem borer infestation. You'll start to see these dead and dying petioles hanging off of the plant. Now, depending on the development of the plant, when they start laying their eggs, These might be higher up in the canopy, they might be quite visible, or if they laid those eggs, say in the mid-vegetative stages, if that soybean plant was a little bit delayed and you still have a lot of vegetative growth going on after the fact, they might be buried down deeper in the canopy. But finding these dead and wilting petioles out there tends to be your first indication that you have a Dectes stem borer infestation, in addition to simply finding the adults out in the field.
Hey,
Now,
Nick, this is Todd real quick. Your slides aren't advancing. You may need to select the screen or select an option to advance your screen.
Well, they are advancing on my screen.
Okay. On our end, it's not. We're still at the primary picture.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay. So let me go back and I'll just show you a few of these pictures here. But here's the picture of the adult that I attempted to show you earlier. And here, especially, are some pictures of these dead and wilting petioles. That's going to be your first indication most of the time that you have a Dectes stem borer infestation. So this on into, early mid-July, you should really be looking out for these as an indication that you might have an infested field. Often they'll break off of there. You'll find the dead petiole just sort of hanging out in the canopy. When you pick those petioles apart, you can often find the small larvae within those, although they do tend to be fairly small at that stage, so it can be difficult to find those larvae. Now, as the larvae continue to mature, they will work their way into the main stem. And if you split those infested main stems open, they're really going to jump out at you at this point. And in Illinois, this is really the only insect that's going to have this appearance. The larva is somewhat featureless, although it does have a broad darkened head capsule, which you can kind of see right here. But they create this tunnel right in the middle of the plant, in the pith of the plant. And that tunnel often is going to extend as the season progresses all the way up and down that soybean plant. And this looks pretty ugly, looks pretty concerning. I know the first time that I saw it, it was eye-opening. You'll notice one of the real key giveaways here, that tunnel is going to be lined with this dark brown, we call it frass. That's our fancy entomology word for poop. That's all it is. But that lines these tunnels, gives them a pretty distinctive appearance. Now, somewhat incredibly, this tunneling up and down the main stem doesn't cause much yield loss. What little yield loss there is from that, what little seed filling there is from that tunneling itself, is so slight that it's difficult to measure. So that actual main stem tunneling, in terms of managing this insect, is not our primary concern when we talk about Dectes stem borer. Our concern comes in later on in the season. So I told you earlier that those larvae are going to overwinter. They'll overwinter within the base of the stem. They actually create a nice little cavity for themselves that you can see here. One thing that's interesting to note about Dectes stem borer larvae, they are cannibalistic. They will feed on each other, so you're often going to only find one per stem. And if you're that first larva that gets down into the base of the stem, you want to make sure that you protect yourself from your brothers and sisters who could potentially work their way down there and eat you and take your overwintering spot away. So they plug the base of the stem with sawdust that they scrape away from it. As you can see here, you can see this plug up towards the top. And then if you look up here, what this larva has done is actually girdled that stem from the inside out. So they're going to chew their way around that, weaken that stem, and that causes the main stem to fall off of there. which protects the larva, but obviously leads to lodging at the end of the season in soybean plants that have this. And if you have enough of this kind of infestation, these mature infestations, larvae that work their way down to the base of the stem and girdle these stems, you can get some pretty substantial lodging in some cases. Here's a picture from Southern Illinois 2 years ago where you had some fairly severe lodging in parts of this field. You can see this is the inset picture here. You're looking down the stem and you can kind of see that plug that's in there where that Dectes larva is spending the winter. There are some varietal differences in susceptibility both to the borer itself and to lodging due to Dectes stem borer. But there's a lot that we don't necessarily know about, especially the timing of this lodging and what the cues are. That's something that we're working on developing a better understanding of. We also don't have anything that could be considered a resistant variety for this, but it is a good idea, you know, to pay attention with your different varieties. You might find that you have a variety that's just more susceptible to this sort of damage than some of the others. But we haven't become very good at predicting what those varieties are and why yet. It doesn't seem to be a simple explanation as to why some varieties are more susceptible to this kind of damage. But that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid lodging, and our management is going to focus on identifying and mitigating those fields that are likely to lodge. One indication that you'll get right at the end of the season, in addition to going out and scouting by splitting these stems and finding the larvae, which you'll know those if you see them. I think once you've seen it once, you're not going to mistake it for anything else. Another indication you'll have closer to the end of the season is this pile of sawdust that forms after that larva has girdled that stem. So when you find this sawdust down at the base of the stem, that stem has already been girdled from the inside out, and it's just waiting on a wind or something to come by to knock that plant over before it will lodge. So when you see a lot of these piles of sawdust out in your field close to harvest, that's a pretty good indication that lodging could be imminent. So in terms of management, in terms of the management practices that we have for Dectes, we're not recommending chemical control at this time. You can get some control of the adults with a variety of different materials. To get effective control of the adults that leads to a reduction in larval tunneling, it would take multiple applications, and we don't have a way to predict when that's going to be economic for you. And when we talk about multiple applications to get effective control, we're talking potentially weekly. These things lay eggs over a relatively extended period of time, 6 to 8 weeks. So we haven't been able to make chemical control of the adults pay for itself. And of course, the larvae, when they're inside of that main stem, you're not going to reach them with the insecticides that we have available to us in soybean. Our management efforts, we really want to focus on mitigating that lodging and preventing that lodging from occurring on us. The best way that we can do that is a timely harvest. And obviously, that's not a situation we always have control over. In fact, often we do not have control over that. It's often the weather that's going to lead to that situation where our beans sit out in the field for too long. What we can do is identify those fields that are infested with Dectes stem borer before harvest, starting in late summer by going out, looking for those wilted petioles, looking for those main stems that have been infested, and identifying, okay, I have an infested field. I have a field that has a heavy Dectes population. We might want to put that one first on the docket for harvest when the time comes down the road, so it's not sitting out there, doesn't have more of an opportunity to hang out in the field and lodge than what we're sort of forced to have from Mother Nature. And then especially at the end of the season, when you start to identify those sawdust piles, that's really an indication that it's time to get those soybeans out of the field at your soonest opportunity before this lodging starts to occur. The good news is the lodging isn't terribly common. Often we will have pretty high rates of infestation and not get to a situation where we have lodging occurring. But that's what we're trying to avoid. Just a few other kind of management tidbits in this. We do tend to have more Dectes infestation in areas that have a lot of conservation tillage. Tillage isn't necessarily a great control for an individual field, but it does reduce the survival of those overwintering insects. And so we do tend to see more of this infestation, especially in southern Illinois and some of these areas where we're heavy no-till. So that tends to be where we're more likely to have this issue. Working on identifying some more management options, identifying if there is a fit for chemical control out there, if we can predict some of these varieties that are more likely to be infested, and some other cultural management practices to help us mitigate Dectes stem borer infestation. The good news on it, again, is that the main stem tunneling in and of itself is not a huge yield reducer. It's that lodging that we want to avoid, and that's what's going to potentially impact yield at the end of the season. And we do have a new fact sheet that we've produced that you can access at the link below. Details some of the biology and management that I've described for you here today, along with a little more background information on this insect. But with that, I will move on, switch gears a little bit, talk a little bit about managing stink bugs in soybean. Another insect that, there's been stink bugs in Illinois for as long as there's been in Illinois, I suppose. We've always had these species with us, especially the primary species we see in soybeans, the green and brown stink bugs. But in recent years, we have been seeing more instances of stink bug damage in soybean. 2 years ago, or actually 3 years ago, was particularly bad. But we've been seeing this more, especially in southern Illinois, but in some years we've actually seen some damage creeping up into central Illinois, where we're maybe not so used to dealing with stink bugs as a soybean pest. So you see here a brown stink bug feeding on the pod, and that in soybeans is where we're concerned. You will pick up stink bugs in vegetative soybeans occasionally. They don't really do any damage to speak of at that stage. We're not really concerned about stink bugs in soybean, really until we get into R4, R5, R6, and especially R5 and R6 is when we start to see those numbers build up. But these are seed feeders. These really want to be feeding on the seeds and the pod. That's where they get their nourishment. So with the stink bug, somewhat unique, well, not really unique, but unlike a lot of the defoliating pests that we have in soybean, stink bugs have what's called a piercing, sucking mouth part. So their mouth part is actually like a straw or like a syringe. They're going to inject that mouth part into the tissue they're feeding on. Again, typically this is going to be a developing seed within the pod. They'll actually liquefy a portion of that tissue and then ingest it. This does a few things. One, it does remove material from that, and so can result in yield loss that way. It also is going to interfere with the growth of that bit of tissue that it's fed on. Often when you get stink bug feeding, you'll get some distortion, some discoloration around that feeding point where growth has been suspended. That's why when you see stink bug damage, a lot of times you'll see a lot of these wrinkled seeds, deformed seeds. You'll see these blotches on the seeds, and that, of course, can be an issue for quality, as well as offering a potential introduction point for pathogens when they feed later in the season. So the earlier that soybean seed is, when that stink bug feeds on it, the more of an issue we have with yield loss. And as the seed grows and develops, if you have a late R5 or an R6 seed when that stink bug feeds on it, you're worried more about the quality issues at that point once that seed size has been set. Now, the major species we have in Illinois, first the green stink bug, helps to be able to identify these, particularly the nymphs. With the green stink bug, obviously it's green. We're not always terribly creative with our names in pest management for these different pests. You'll see it tends to have this sort of orange border around the body here. The nymphs, the immatures, right when they hatch, they're almost entirely black with some white spots along the back. As they develop, you'll see more of a green coloration, more of the green and orange, and less of the black coloration back here. And by the time they're an almost mature larva, the body will be almost entirely green with the green stink bugs. You can see a picture of an egg mass in your lower left-hand corner. Not very easy to distinguish a green stink bug egg mass from a brown stink bug egg mass, but both of these stink bugs have egg masses that appear like this. So when you start to see those egg masses out in the field, you know, that's an indication that your population could start to build as those eggs hatch and the nymphs develop over the next several weeks. Brown stink bug, obviously it's brown. There are several species of stink bugs that appear very similar that we all refer to as brown stink bugs, and many of them do the same sort of damage in soybean. One tidbit with brown stink bugs, they do tend to be a little bit more difficult to control with an insecticide than the green stink bugs, so just keep that in mind during your scouting efforts. If you have a population that is heavy with brown stink bugs, you might want to target that with a bifenthrin or even with an organophosphate like acephate if you have high numbers of brown stink bugs out there. Where with green stink bugs, almost any pyrethroid insecticide is going to provide effective control in Illinois. You'll see the brown stink bugs as an immature, they have almost this lime green coloration, so it can be somewhat difficult to identify if you're not used to seeing them, somewhat difficult to distinguish which immature goes with which stink bug until you've learned how to identify these. Now the brown and the green stink bugs, the damage that they do in soybean is essentially the same. And when you're scouting for them, you know, often you will have a mixed population of these two insects. And for scouting purposes, for threshold purposes, you should count both of these the same, and you should count immatures and adults the same. So the immatures and the adults are going to do the same kind of damage in the field. One that's a newer species, this is an invasive species that arrived in the US, I guess it's been around 12 to 15 years ago now. It's been in Illinois for several years, and we've had building populations over the last several years. It's the brown marmorated stink bug. The adult, you can kind of see here, looks very similar to a brown stink bug. It does have more of a mottled appearance, more of a mottled coloration around the back. The real key diagnostic feature here is these white bands that you can see on the antennae. Once you get used to looking at these, you'll see the way that they move about is a little bit different from a brown stink bug. There's some other superficial differences as well. The immatures are quite different in appearance, as you can see here. Now this again is an invasive species. We've been seeing higher numbers of this insect in Illinois over the last several years. We actually haven't seen big issues in soybean with brown marmorated stink bug yet. One thing about brown marmorated stink bug, they have a wide variety of different host plants. They have hundreds of different host plants actually. And so where you have a lot of different potential host plants out in the environment, you sort of water down that population. They're not going to really key in on soybean any more than they key in on other plants that are fruiting at that time. Where this is a really big problem is actually in some of our specialty crop production, some of our orchard crops, fruits and vegetables. That's where brown marmorated stink bug can be really nasty. One of the issues issues you do have to think about in soybean with this insect, it's a little more difficult to scout for than brown and green stink bugs. They're a little better at avoiding the sweep net and avoiding detection. So that's where brown marmorated stink bug can be a little bit different in soybean. But again, something that we're on the lookout for, but haven't had major issues with in Illinois to date. I did want to mention a little bit today about the red-banded stink bug. This is an insect that we haven't seen much of in Illinois to date, and hopefully we continue to not see much of in Illinois to date, because it's been a major issue for our colleagues to the south. So major issue in mid-southern U.S. soybean production, especially in Louisiana and the coastal bend of Texas. So red-banded stink bug is somewhat of a subtropical insect, does not do very well with cold winters. So the next time we have a really nasty cold stretch in Illinois, you can at least be thankful that because of that, we do not have the issues with red-banded stink bug that our colleagues to the south have. You see, of course, the identifying feature here, they have this red band across the back. Can be confused with the red-shouldered stink bug, which is an insect we do have in Illinois fairly commonly. The immature is very distinctive here. But the reason we're concerned about red-banded stink bug compared with brown stink bug and green stink bug and brown marmorated stink bug, they're more damaging than these other species in soybean. That's for several reasons. One, they have a mouth part that's actually a little bit wider than green stink bug and brown stink bug. Actually, one of my colleagues in the southern U.S., he compared it to straws. So he said if brown and green stink bugs have a little coffee stirrer straw with that tiny little opening in it, red-banded stink bugs, their mouth part is more like a giant Slurpee straw that you might get with a milkshake. They're just able to ingest a lot more material, and they do ingest a lot more material. Another issue with red-banded stink bug is they have a much stronger preference for beans and other legumes. So they tend to really key in on soybean when you have a lot of soybean in the environment. Because of that, they build up to much higher levels, much higher population levels, much more quickly than green and brown stink bugs do. They also have a tendency to hang out in the field longer. So they tend to have these large numbers and stay in the field really up to harvest. Down south, it's very common to be finding these out in the field after soybeans have matured and they're out there harvesting still. Thankfully, again, we haven't had a major issue with this in Illinois to date, but it is something that we're watching out for, especially in southern Illinois, and especially in years like this year where they had a milder winter to our south, and they've really had a lot of activity already in the season down in Louisiana and Mississippi, coming on into Arkansas. So something certainly we want to be on the lookout for, and especially if we start to see these building up in numbers in soybean in southern Illinois, that's something we want to identify and potentially mitigate very quickly, because these can be a major issue for production, cause very severe yield losses and quality reductions when they build up. But again, so far, the species that we're dealing with in Illinois primarily are going to be the green stink bug, the brown stink bug, and the brown marmorated stink bug. In terms of management in Illinois, one thing that you really want to keep in mind and key in on here, these infestations, damaging infestations, typically aren't going to occur until late in the season. You can pick up some stink bugs, again, in vegetative stage soybean. We don't see a lot of that. They're not really doing any damage until you have a pod on that plant. And just when we tend to see the highest numbers is going to be at R5 and R6. Another thing to keep in mind here, we have a habit in Illinois, some would say a bad habit, of putting out an insecticide at R3, often just because we're going across the field. For something like a stink bug, that insecticide at R3 in almost every case is going to be about as good as nothing. It's not that the insecticide won't kill the insect, it's that it's not going to be there anymore when that insect arrives in the field. We're looking at scouting for stink bugs at a time when we're not really used to scouting for insects in Illinois. Late R5, R6 is when these are going to show up. And we do have insecticides that are effective for stink bug control, but they're only going to be effective if they're applied when that insect is out there at damaging levels. You're not going to get good efficacy with the preventive insecticide. You're only going to get a successful control if you target that insect when it's actually out there in the field and when it's actually out there in the field at damaging levels. So that's when you really want to be, if you're concerned about stink bug damage, and if you're in the, especially the southern half of Illinois, but coming on up into central Illinois now, I would say you should be concerned with stink bug damage. The key is to scout for it, to go out and find it at R5 and R6. Ideally, you would do this scouting with the sweep net. I know we don't have a lot of sweep nets going out in Illinois, but that's going to be the most reliable scouting tool for stink bugs. That economic threshold is 9 stink bugs in 25 sweeps out in the soybean field. When you're at that level, you're not going to have any trouble finding stink bugs out in your field. It's not something that you're likely to miss if you're out there scouting. And when you're scouting a field that has stink bugs at an economic threshold level, you're going to be seeing them up in that canopy more often than not, and you're not going to have to look for them very hard to find high numbers. But we don't want to be putting out an insecticide unless we're at that economic threshold. So that's going to be the key with stink bugs. Again, scout for them, treat as needed, which isn't going to be a high percentage of fields in Illinois, but it will be some fields many years, especially in the southern half of the state. If you have an economic infestation, if it's primarily green stink bugs, a pyrethroid insecticide is going to do great. If you get good coverage, you're not going to have issues controlling that insect. Brown stink bug or brown marmorated stink bugs can be a little bit more difficult to control if you have high populations of those. But with a bifenthrin or a organophosphate insecticide like acetate, you can get successful control of that insect as well. If you find red-banded stink bugs in threshold numbers in southern Illinois, please let us know about it. That's something we would want to be monitoring very closely. That would be, that's a pretty impactful insect if we start to pick those up in numbers. Fortunately, again, we've not seen that insect in numbers yet in Illinois, but it's something we want to be vigilant for, something we want to be prepared for, and if we do find it, we can learn from some of the lessons they've learned from this insect over the last 5 years or so down in the southern U.S. But hopefully we continue not to see it, and our hard winters continue to keep that particular one away from us, and we don't have to deal with it. Those are my favorite kinds of insect pests, of course, are the ones that we don't really have to deal with, that we can just be aware of and deal with as they come up. So with that, I'll move on to some insects that are maybe a little more familiar to us in Illinois, and those are the defoliating insects. We have a wide variety of these. Certainly they're the most common pests that we have in Illinois. We're talking about our Japanese beetles, our bean leaf beetles, our green clover worms, in some cases in southern Illinois, our soybean loopers. Early on in the season, we occasionally have issues with armyworms, variegated cutworm, a variety of other caterpillar pests that can feed on soybean tissue. I found a thistle caterpillar the other day, another one that can occasionally get to us in Illinois. As many of you know, and as I know I've talked about many times in the past, most of the defoliation that we see in Illinois is more cosmetic than anything else. Soybean tolerates a lot of defoliation. It especially tolerates a lot of defoliation early in the season, in the vegetative stages. In fact, our economic threshold for soybean defoliation in vegetative soybean is 30%. 30% of that canopy eaten away. You can see a nice image up here of exactly what 30% defoliation looks like. That's pretty tore up, pretty chewed up. Soybeans are able to recover from that damage very effectively. After bloom, they do become more susceptible to that sort of damage. We drop our threshold at that point to 20% defoliation. Still pretty high, right? Still a lot of defoliation out there. You can see a picture here that I took a couple of years ago when we did have some fairly high levels of defoliation, at least higher levels than we're used to seeing in Illinois. This is a picture that we went through and measured the actual canopy defoliation and got 16%, 16% average defoliation in this field, which you can see looks pretty chewed up, but is still below our economic threshold for defoliation. Now, the procedure for scouting for this, you want to identify the level of defoliation that you have out in the field. When you determine that you're at a threshold for that, you then want to go through and identify the insect that's responsible for that defoliation. For a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that you select a control option that's effective for the particular insect that you have out there. And two, of course, to make sure that the insect is still there, that it hasn't done its defoliation and moved on. Bean leaf beetles in particular are notorious for that, for being here today and gone tomorrow. Very highly mobile insect as far as where they'll go. We don't want to put out a revenge spray for defoliation that has already occurred. But again, most of the defoliation that you see out there in most years is going to be more of a cosmetic issue than anything else. It's rare in Illinois to experience yield loss in soybeans from defoliation. Those thresholds are relatively high for a reason. Soybean is fairly tolerant of that kind of defoliation. One thing I did want to point out to you that is somewhat timely right now would be potential issues with armyworm. We do have a reasonably high armyworm population in some parts of the state right now. And those can, in some cases in seedling soybeans, actually tear up the canopy to the point that you have some stand loss. And that, of course, is a different situation from just worrying about defoliation. Where you especially want to scout for these is going to be following a grass of some kind. Often this is a weed, and where we have the worst problems with armyworms, typically that's a situation where we had a grassy weed infestation, and for whatever reason, our herbicide control was either late or only moderately effective. And so you have those grassy weeds dying at a time when the soybeans are popping up out of the ground, and those armyworms need something to feed on, and so they move over to the soybean. Soybean in and of itself, if you have a clean, weed-free soybean stand, soybeans are not a very attractive oviposition site for armyworm moths. And so it's fairly uncommon to get severe armyworm damage in a clean stand of soybean. Where you can get into some issues is where you had a very attractive oviposition site, either within that field early or next to that field. And two other examples of this would be if you're next to a wheat field, where you've had a lot of armyworm oviposition, and especially as that wheat starts to dry down, if they start to migrate over. They do call them armyworms for a reason. Those larvae, when they run out of food, will start to sort of march in unison until they find the next food source. The other situation where we've been seeing some damage from armyworms in Illinois is following a rye cover crop. So a cover crop is going to be a pretty attractive oviposition site to armyworm moths, and occasionally, especially when we have termination of that cover, and again, that rye is dying right as that soybean is coming up out of the ground, if you have armyworms in there, they will move over to the soybeans. So that's where you want to be vigilant to this. And again, just keep in mind, if you have a little bit of chewing on the leaves, like you see in this particular picture here, that's not going to be a big issue. Where you're worried about armyworms and other early season caterpillar pests like this, variegated cutworm would be another example of an insect that you can occasionally have problems with after maybe a not so great season of early season weed control. That's where you want to be on the lookout, is when you start to have stand loss. Fortunately, in terms of control, if you do need to control armyworms out in your field, pyrethroid insecticides remain very effective in Illinois. Control in and of itself usually isn't a problem if you can get good coverage, penetrate through whatever canopy you have out there, and actually reach those armyworm larvae where they are. The challenge typically is identifying those fields through effective scouting early in the season. Of course, early in the season, we have a lot of other things to think about. We have planting still continuing. We have replanting continuing. We have 4.5-inch rains like we got at my research farm last night. All those fun issues that come up that prevent us from getting out there and scouting. But if we're able to identify these problems early in the season, and even as we get on later into the season, identify these problems as they're occurring, we usually have a very effective mitigation, and we can control these relatively uncommon insect infestations that we see in Illinois soybeans. With that, do want to thank you for listening, and I believe we have a Q&A session coming up to conclude the session.
Thank you so much, Nick. I got a few questions that have been sent in. I'll just read them one at a time, and then you can address them as we go. The first one is, what are the low temperatures or other winter characteristics that can cause some mortality with the stem borer can survival? Basically, it's ranges.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and we do tend to have more stem borer issues in southern Illinois. That probably has more to do with the tillage situation in southern Illinois than it does the actual temperatures. So they'll survive in Nebraska, for instance. They'll survive at fairly high latitudes. But where they don't survive very well is in areas like central Illinois, where we have not just tillage in an individual field, but heavy conventional tillage across a wide area. That really does tend to prevent those populations from building up. Where we have large areas of conservation tillage, that tends to favor these populations really over time. You know, it's not something that's going to build up in a year. It's not one of these insect pests that's going to come out of nowhere. It might seem like it's come out of nowhere because they're sort of difficult to find if you don't know what you're looking for. The larvae are hidden within that stem. But we can have, overwintering survival in Illinois tends not to be a challenge for this insect. The challenge is more, what are your residue situations like, and what have they been like over the last, several years to allow these populations to build up.
Thank you, Nick. The second one I have, how do you establish natural enemies in a soybean field for pest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in terms of establishing natural enemies, the first thing we want to think about in soybean is really what we want to not do. What we want to avoid are any insecticide applications that are not warranted by economic pressure out there in the field. That's the worst thing we can do for those beneficial insects, is an insecticide that's going to go through and kill them, right? That includes foliar insecticides. That includes insecticide seed treatments that aren't justified by the early season insect pressure that we have out there. There are various conservation practices to favor beneficial insects. For instance, putting out floral resources, more flowering plants near soybean fields, that's often not a real palatable option in our conventional soybean systems in Illinois. But really, when we talk about favor and beneficial insects in soybean in Illinois, the number one thing that you can do for that is to scout your fields, and if you put out an insect control, do it based on threshold, do it based on field history, do it based on the actual risk of a damaging insect infestation in that soybean field. The reality in Illinois is the majority of soybean fields in a given year do not have an economic infestation of an insect most of the time. We've got to be vigilant for those issues that we do have. But if we can stop targeting some of those non-existent pests with like an R3 insecticide spray when we did not have an insect pest out in the field, that's going to be the best thing that we can do to favor those beneficials.
Thank you, Nick. The next question is around economic thresholds based off the different type of stink bugs. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, great question. So for brown, green, and brown marmorated stink bugs, the threshold is going to be the same. It's going to be 9 per 25 sweeps if you're using a sweep net. It's going to be 1 per row foot if you're using a drop cloth or a careful examination of that soybean canopy. If we were to get into red-banded stink bugs, if we were to have that insect move into the state, that threshold is going to be reduced. When I was in Arkansas, they were recommending a threshold of 4 red-banded stink bugs in 25 sweeps. That's a pretty dramatic reduction, right? So less than half of the threshold for those other stink bug pests that we're more used to seeing in Illinois. And there's a reason for that. That insect is simply much more damaging than the greens and the browns and brown marmorateds that we have. In terms of the species that we see in Illinois, the bigger difference between them is not going to be so much what the threshold is as what we reach for in terms of control if we do reach that threshold. Brown stink bugs and brown marmorated stink bugs just tend to be a little bit more difficult to control than green stink bugs.
Thanks, Nick. I think the last one we have here, have you seen any larvae or adult gulls in Illinois yet?
Great question. We have not. So we've not found the gull midge. I think many of you have heard of the gull midge, especially out in western Iowa and eastern Nebraska. We are kicking off a scouting effort for that this year. We're going to conduct a survey in Illinois, concentrating on western and northwestern Illinois, where we're closest to the infestations that have been established. Would like to throw out there, if you happen to find something that you believe is a soybean gull midge, and the symptoms of that, the symptoms on the plant resemble early dieback from a variety of diseases, right? From SDS or any of these soybean diseases that cause that plant to die early. When you pull that plant up out of the ground, you peel back the skin of it, and you'll find these tiny orange maggots, fly larvae, within that stem. If you find that this year in Illinois, please let us know as soon as you can, and we'll take samples of that. We'll take a look at it, send it to the experts out in Nebraska and Iowa, and get a positive or a negative ID on that. That is something we take pretty seriously, is making sure if it does arrive in the state that we identify it right away so that we can begin addressing that insect. To date, we've not found it in Illinois, and God willing, we will continue to not find it this year. Hopefully by the time it gets here, they've got some awesome control recommendations for us from Nebraska and Iowa, and we can just hand you those and deal with it in stride. But that's been a really challenging situation for them. It's not very common that we get a soybean pest or a major crop pest that's new to science. And that was the situation with that soybean gull midge. So really really sort of an incredible series of events with that insect. But fortunately, no, we do not have that, or at least we have not confirmed that in Illinois at this point. And again, hopefully we continue to not find it.
Thank you, Nick. I believe that is it for the questions. It also concludes our webinar on insect pest management in soybeans. Our next LSoy Advisor webinar will be on June 25th, and you can register for that event and view other recordings presented about soybean agronomics through the checkoff-funded website, lsoyadvisor.com. With that, we'd like to thank everybody and have a great day.